everyone, it's Melissa, and today I am sharing with you my rankings for the Booktube Prize quarterfinals. I was judging nonfiction Group D. I am going to start with my bottom, number 6, and we'll work our way up to my number 1. So what I put in the number 6 position was The Lumumba Plot, The Secret History of the CIA, and a Cold War Assassination by Stuart A. Reid. And this book is about Patrice Lumumba, who was the first prime minister of the Congo when it gained its independence from Belgium in the early 1960s. It's about his life, and it's about what happened with the independence and the ensuing chaos and mutinies and switching of regimes. It focuses heavily on the US's involvement with wanting to, like, the CIA's plot to assassinate the President Lumumba, and focuses heavily on the US's involvement and not so much on other things. So while I was reading it, I was interested in what was being talked about. I wasn't necessarily disliking anything while reading it. I was interested in a lot of the facts I was learning about what happened when Congo was able to break free from Belgium. But overall, the book is lacking. So it might have been an all right reading experience, but when I was done, I was like, that wasn't quite it. By the end of reading this book, I couldn't even tell you what Lumumba's politics were. I think that's a grave oversight. I feel like after all of these pages of reading about him as a person and his kind of rise to power and how he became one of the leaders, like right before independence, and then how he rose to be prime minister, his dealings with diplomacy and the UN and how that all kind of fell apart, I still couldn't tell you what his politics are. All I could say is that he was a nationalist. That's all I could tell you based on what I've read in this book. The book omits a lot about the UN's role in kind of the chaos that was Congolese independence and its choices to, like, not protect Lumumba when he was under threat before he was assassinated. And it also omits a lot about Belgium's role. So it's fine to, like, focus on the US's role. I think the author obviously wanted to talk a lot about the CIA's involvement. That's fine, but it really smacks as being a super biased account of what happened. And that bias is not immediately evident while you're reading it. It wasn't until after, when I really started digesting the information, and I was like, wait, I have to go read more about this. And, like, yes, it really downplays, like, Belgium and the UN's role. And when you have that amount of bias in a work of nonfiction, like, sorry, you're going to end up at the bottom of my pile. So that was The Lumumba Plot. And number 5, not a bad book, just not a spectacular book, which is why it's number 5, is The Dictionary People, The Unsung Heroes Who Created the Oxford English Dictionary by Sarah Ogilvie. This is essentially snapshots of the variety of contributors who helped create the Oxford English Dictionary over the decades that it took to create it. And it was interesting to read about a lot of the different people. I mean, there are some real characters in there. It was a solid enough book. It was an interesting enough book. I don't really have anything bad to say about the book. It just was a pretty basic book, not in par with other books on this list, and I think over time probably is going to be pretty forgettable for me. So it was fun to read. I think a lot of people would get a lot of enjoyment out of reading this and reading about the different people who made the dictionary possible. It's not going to be elevated on this list. So that was number 5. Number 4 is a really good book, but I mean, there has to be a cutoff for the top 3 somewhere. So number 4 is Flee North, A Forgotten Hero and the Fight for Freedom in Slavery's Borderland by Scott Shane. I really enjoyed this book. I would recommend this book. I just liked the other 3 books better. This is a really great biography of someone called Thomas Smallwood, who was born into slavery and earned his freedom, earned it financially. And he's a bit of a forgotten yet very instrumental individual in terms of the Underground Railroad and getting people north to Canada during slavery, especially in that borderland in Maryland. And I learned a lot about how the whole system of like slave traders and everything happened in Maryland and Baltimore in that area, which I didn't actually really know much about. I think as someone outside the United States, my knowledge of slavery in the States is very focused on the South. And so I didn't know much about that edge, that border, and the role that those states played, specifically Maryland. So that was very, very interesting. My favorite part of this book was reading the different letters, the different articles that Smallwood would publish in newspapers and whatnot, where he was essentially trolling slaveholders. So after he would help free and smuggle out, I guess, different slaves to flee north, once they were safe, he would essentially write these letters, these articles, publicly shaming the slaveholders or the owners and traders and whoever was involved in the slave trade. They were just a joy to read. Very acerbic, very witty, and really just a joyful feeling of reading how he like stuck it to the man in the best way possible. So I really enjoyed that particular part of the book, but the book as a whole was really interesting, and I'm glad I learned about him and what he did, and a little bit more about like how that trade, the domestic slave trade, worked. So that's number 4. Number 3 is The Wager, A Tale of Shipwreck, Mutiny, and Murder by David Grann. This is about a ship called The Wager that was shipwrecked in the mid-1700s. So it was part of I can't remember the technical word, the convoy of ships that was heading on this secret mission during the war with Spain. And it was shipwrecked off the coast of the southern horn of South America. And it recounts the tale of what happened on this very desolate island with not a lot of resources, including, as the title would suggest, mutiny and murder, and everything that happened on the island, how they were able to get off the island, how the survivors survived, how the survivors were received back to England, how they were perceived by other people. And I just found it so interesting. And this particular subject is not one that I'm particularly interested in. Shipwrecks or nautical stories or like anything like that. But the story was just so compelling. It was written in such a compelling way. I think he really knows how to turn a story. It was very narrative nonfiction, and it really pulls you along. So I had to put it in the top 3 just because it was something that I looked forward to picking up and reading more about. So that was my number 3. Number 2 is We Were Once a Family, A Story of Love, Death, and Child Removal in America by Roxanna Asgarian. This book is about child welfare in America more broadly, but it explores that specifically through this one case that the author, a journalist, had investigated about this family, this couple. Basically, it was a murder-suicide. They drove their van off of a cliff with them and their 6 adopted children inside of it. They were both white women, and their adopted children were all Black, and that plays into the book, like what it explores in terms of the child welfare system. So she's really investigating and talking about this case specifically, but is able to kind of do a dive into what this means for like the foster care and adoption systems in America as a whole. She goes into the children's history with their families, explores their history with CPS, and talks about the abuse they faced after they were removed from their birth families, which is something that is backwards to how most people, I think, view foster or adoption. They view it as saving children from abusive situations, which sometimes it does, but this is all too common, where children are removed from the care of their birth families because of neglect, which is often just a synonym for poverty, and that there oftentimes isn't really abuse there, and that this money that is fueling the system might be better spent actually helping families in poverty. The author talks a lot about how classism and racism play into the child welfare system and how it's really built on that. And it's just an excellent book. It is really eye-opening. And I already knew a lot of this in terms of the broad strokes, but seeing some of the specifics about how this works, the cronyism in the courtroom between the judges and different attorneys, there's a lot to it that is rage-inducing. It is a very frustrating book to read in that way. It's something that really got my blood boiling, but I couldn't not give it the number 2 slot. I just think it was really well written and so topical and relevant and important. And yeah, that's why it's at my number 2 spot. My number 1 slot goes to Wifedom, Mrs. Orwell's Invisible Life by Anna Funder. This is a book about George Orwell's wife, Eileen, and how she was basically erased from history, how she is a footnote at best in his biographies, even though she was instrumental to his success. Obviously instrumental in terms of supporting him by being someone who took care of the household and did all of the admin in that way to free him up to be able to write, but also literally in terms of helping him develop ideas, helping him with her own thoughts. She edited a lot of stuff for him, and she's not talked about. The author uses some newly discovered letters that Eileen had written to a good friend of hers that gives a little bit more context to her life and her life adjacent to her husband. We get the factual information that we afford from her letters and other letters and biographies on George Orwell. But the author does something different as well, where she kind of imagines or speculates these different scenarios under which these letters might have been written. So there are these fictionalized elements where she is imagining what Eileen might have been doing, what might have been happening while she was writing this letter. And it's based on what we know about what was happening in her life at the time. So there's elements of reality in that, but it's kind of a unique way of going about making her life and her as a person feel more real and present. I thought it was a really interesting device. I sometimes struggle with fictionalized elements like that, but I think they ultimately end up working, and it's clear obviously that she is imagining these scenarios that go along with these letters that Eileen had written. Additionally, I loved how the author broadened out the scope of this a little bit. It very much is about Eileen, but I like how she was able to talk a little bit about spouses of writers in general, typically wives, and how they are these invisible people behind their husbands, behind their writing spouses, these writers who would not have the luxury of time to write or time to build a career as a writer if it weren't for their wives who were supporting them. That their ability to create a successful writing career is built upon the labor of their wives, and that's just something that's never really talked about or considered. I just thought that this book was really well written, really interesting, and something that I never really thought about before. I never really thought about George Orwell's wife. Why would I care about his wife? Well, I'll tell you, she is worth caring about. She is worth knowing about. And I just have to applaud the author's ability to just bring this person to life. Those are my rankings for the Booktube prize. If you've read any of these books, please let me know in the comments what you thought about them, if you've agreed with me or not. I would love to have a chat about any of these books with you. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and we'll chat soon. Take care. Bye.